that the subject for this afternoon is real versus fake news about World War II. Come on. And I came across this old PowerPoint that I gave a long time ago, and it is sufficiently interesting that it's worth showing. It'll only take me a couple seconds. We call it modern mythology because everything you know is fake, and Bill Casey will be satisfied that they've done their job when everything we believe is fake. A great deal of what we believe, think about the world in which we live is just wrong. Why is it wrong? The best way to study a subject is to understand it thoroughly. This initially sounds silly, but anytime you study any subject, you study it flying at speaking metaphorically, you study it flying at 5,000 feet, you study it again flying at 1,000 feet, you study it again driving across the countryside in a car, and you study it the fourth time walking the road. Each time you get a different perception and a whole lot more information, and each time piece A and C and X fit together more neatly. You and I have been taught in terms of history that history consists of good guys and bad guys, bad nations and special nations. Especially you hear Obama, you hear representatives of the State Department talking about how exceptional and not irreplaceable, how important and necessary it is for the United States to exist. The good guys and good nations and bad nations don't exist. And the very the very way of thinking about history in those terms makes it difficult to understand events. An incomplete list of the situations causing misery in our time, dysfunctional economic and political systems that lead to massive and progressive wealth inequality, disenfranchisement of 99% of the people, the major influence of a powerful foreign power, and I don't list it here, but the powerful foreign power is not Russia or China in terms of American politics, it's Israel. When the Zionists decide that something needs to be done, it will get done. And is there some resistance? Yeah. So far, the Zionists have not persuaded the American government to attack Iran. But they are working on it and have been working on it since before 9/11. We have lost popular influence with governments and corporations and instruments of information entertainment. The educational system has ceased to be an instrument whereby citizens become independent adults, but it has become a state instrument for fulfilling state and corporate needs. It's modeled after the Prussian and Indian systems where the control of the lower classes is achieved by adapting the episcopal system of control of Great Britain. Going back to Aldous Huxley, where the vast majority of human beings are scientifically managed by the ruling elites. Wars, which the United States has been involved in 93% of its existence, are the economic necessity for the American economy. Every major war since 1900 has had an economic cause that has been obscured by patriotic rhetoric. Now, today's subject is the misinformation you have been given about World War II. If I were to ask you for a summary of what you know about World War II, you would tell me that Adolf Hitler was a maniac, that he was intent on conquering the world, and that the United States and Western powers were forced into a war with Adolf Hitler and successfully defeated him. Is there anything that you would like to add to that summary? Yes, Tamita.
Reorganizing the colonies. Reorganizing control of the colonies.
Tamita has mentioned that part of Britain's role and part of the United States' role was incorporating former British colonies into a greater Western world. And she's absolutely correct there. In addition to that, something that wasn't in Winston Churchill's plan, but certainly was in the American plan, was reorienting the obedience of those colonies to the United States rather than Great Britain. Winston Churchill never planned for Great Britain to become a colony of the United States, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt certainly did.
Also, that it's Second World War is continuation of First World War, right? I mean, as far as
it is a continuation of the First World War, but that goes back to one of the weaknesses of the way we have been taught history. Dr. Lowen makes the astute observation that at least two of the weaknesses of the American education are that it is taught largely as the events of white, male, wealthy people, with an occasional tip of the hat to the American Indian or to the American black or to the American or to the American woman, but these are gracious, polite tips of the hat as if we've got to give these groups their due. But it's basically taught as the progress of American exceptionalism in conquering the West and in achieving great industrial capacity and giving a vote to everybody. That's one weakness, since it is at the most polite thing I can say about it is it is truncated, eliminating an evaluation of everything that lies beneath that white ruling elite. The other thing that's weak about it, and this is a crucial weakness, is that it teaches about events in an unconnected fashion. Janet has just pointed out that World War II was in fact a continuation of World War I. She's absolutely correct. But you only appreciate that if you start looking at events as they are interconnected with other events and as people are interconnected with other people. Now, let me play for you, and I'm going to cover several other things as well, but this is a very brief commentary or summary of what Norman Dodd has to say about the role of the wealthy elite foundations, the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, whatever, Vanderbilt. You can count them on two hands, the very wealthy foundations that are established on the basis of the wealth of some robber baron of the 19th century in order to influence American culture in the 20th. Norman Dodd, for those of you who have been with me before, know that he was the research director for the Reece Committee, and the Reece Committee was assigned the job of finding out whether who was conducting business in the United States in an un-American fashion. So that one of the things that the Reece Committee needed to do, and the research director was actively involved in, is what do they mean by un-American? And part of this video that is not included here is they concluded that to act in an un-American fashion is to attempt to change American society by means other than those which are indicated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Seems reasonable. This is what Mr. Dodd has to say.
And what we were able to bring forward was that
Sorry about that. I'll get that fixed.
conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation with him?
I remember Brown Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. Of course it didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, "Well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, "Of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose. But I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me?" And his answer was, "We would not think of doing any such thing." So then I said, "Well, Mr. Gaither, obviously you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you just told me."
I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to show you the rest of it in a moment. But when he is talking about integrating the United States population with that of the Soviet Union, he is not talking about converting the United States into a communist entity or a communist revolution. He's talking, as you'll see this later on in the presentation, about adapting each of the two populations to such a degree that the two populations can be integrated in a collectivist fashion, so that they would form one population governed by a select few according to what Aldous Huxley said, scientific principles. So we're not talking about the 1950s investigation of Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White about converting the United States or overthrowing the government and turning it into a communist establishment. We're talking about manipulating the population so that they will be adaptable, as they were planning on adapting the Soviet population to becoming adaptable to management in a collective. I think that's worthy, because it's easy to confuse with what Mr. Dodd says to talking about a communist revolution, and that senator from Wisconsin looking under bed sheets in order to find communists. That's not what Mr. Dodd is talking about. He's talking about the subversion of American culture, not American government.
She came back at the end of 2 weeks
I'm
with the following in the way of, on Dick. You force the Congress to spend this money in order to, at the year 1908, which
a little vignette that I excluded in the editing process. He is now talking about one of his assistants whom he sent to the Ford Foundation to examine their books. This was an offer that the director of the Ford Foundation offered to examine their minutes from the foundation of from the beginning of the foundation until to the present. He gave this young lady instructions to do spot reading. He thought the people who gave him this authority, that this opportunity, were crazy because he had a good idea what was in the minutes. But he gave his assistant instructions to do spot reading. And now he's going to summarize what he found, what she found in reading the minutes of the foundation that he's describing.
was the year that the Carnegie began operations.
Carnegie Foundation, my era.
And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answered that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out.
I'm going to insert here that part of that reversion, they wanted to avoid the reversion to isolationism that was part of the American political gestalt prior to World War I. And it is also the mentality that prevented Woodrow Wilson from bringing the United States into the League of Nations. But that's only part of the gestalt that they wanted to avoid going back to.
And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assembled 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence, a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency.
It's worth adding to that summary of what the American future was intended to be by observing that not only did the American Historical Society become formed at that time, but virtually all of the social studies, psychology and sociology, etc., have also become dominated by a corral of selected experts. And I would like to say that academia was immune from this class manipulation, but I would be totally wrong in saying that. Even as things exist today, people who challenge the official 9/11 story are not employed in American universities, and they have tremendous difficulty getting their scientific work published in American scholarly journals. It is like a religion, and if you don't subscribe to our particular religion, you don't get published. I'm going to show you a couple videos now that summarize true facts about World War II that are in conflict with the stories that you have been told. But I want to share two circumstances that don't appear in either of the two videos that I'm about to share with you. The American story is that the United States entered World War II after the Japanese conducted a sneak attack on our naval and military outpost on Pearl Harbor. In a chronological sense, that is accurate. In an ideological sense, that is what causes what, it is not accurate, because Roosevelt began an economic war with Japan 18 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Moreover, Roosevelt and his closest associates were fully aware of the Japanese Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor. In fact, there is substantial evidence that was given to a close friend of Roosevelt, who happened to be a reporter, that he was working on his speech to Congress at least a day before December 7th. The American Secret Service had successfully broken the Japanese codes. They knew when and where the Japanese were going to be attacking. That information was concealed from the naval commander in charge of Pearl Harbor and the Army commander in charge of the troops on Pearl Harbor. Because as Roosevelt, he said, I want the Japanese to fire the first shot. So as I say, in a chronological sense, the Japanese fired the first shot. In an ideological sense, Roosevelt set them up as surely as I step on somebody's foot in order to get them to take a swing at me. The second thing that does not come through in the history books is that European and specifically Zionist bankers bankrolled Adolf Hitler and bankrolled the career of Winston Churchill. Churchill's commitment to the Zionist bankers was to be sure that the Zionists got Palestine when the war was over. I cannot tell you what the Zionist commitment was to Adolf Hitler. I can tell you that the bankers were very interested in the West defeating the Soviet Union. They really didn't care, the bankers did not care that much as to whether Great Britain succeeded or whether Germany succeeded in defeating the Soviet Union. But they were very concerned that communism be destroyed in Russia. I can provide data for each of those assertions, but I wanted at least to plant the suspicion, the thought in your mind, so that as you read, you may find occasions where that information is consistent with what you are reading.
There was a comment here. You just have a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask you when you were talking about how the Rockefeller foundations were cultivating the academics. In terms of history, is there any evidence that the same thing was done with the climate change scientists? Or were they cultivated as well?
With what scientists?
The climate change scientists, were they cultivated as well in order to create this climate?
Since Rockefeller is interested in the economy through the oil, the short answer is I don't know the specific answer. I can tell you that going back to the conference on fossil fuels around 1896, Rockefeller sent his experts there to introduce the idea that oil and coal and gas were fossil fuels, which was open to debate at that time. Because if you make it a fossil fuel, you make it scarce. And Rockefeller and the people who made their money on oil were very interested in having some justification for having the ability to raise the price on oil and gas. Whether they were actively involved in terms of the development of climate change, I suspect they were, but I do not have specific evidence.
I remember you were talking about Margaret Thatcher and her desire to promote nuclear power and her conflict with the coal miners.
That's a related, but it's a different issue, because Thatcher wanted to disempower the coal miners. That's absolutely correct. And for that reason, wanted to explore nuclear energy. But at that point in time, money was being poured into the climate research. But whether it was being poured into climate research to demonstrate that the globe was warming or not, I don't have that information. Now, first we have Peter. Each of these two people are very good. Come on now. On facts that you were not taught in school.
Three fundamental myths about World War II that we've been confronting. The first is that the United States won the war in Europe, when of course it was the Soviets who won the war in Europe. The second is that the Cold War started during World War II because of Soviet aggression.
Cold War, not the Second World
That
War.
narrative is completely wrong. But the third is that the atomic bombs ended the Pacific War. The reality, as historians understand, is that the atomic bombs had a minimal impact, whereas the Soviet invasion convinced the Japanese that there was no chance for carrying on any longer. In fact, the American intelligence had been saying for months, beginning at least in April, that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in Japan would lead to complete collapse of the Japanese military. And Truman understood this quite well. Truman said he went to Potsdam to make sure that the Soviets were coming into the war. He got Stalin's agreement on July 16th. He writes in his journal, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Fini Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife Bess the next day. Says, the Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the boys who won't be killed. The Americans had broken the Japanese codes. We were intercepting their telegrams. Truman himself refers to the intercepted July 18th telegram as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Truman knew full well that the Japanese were defeated. They were looking for a way to get out. They were trying to negotiate through the Soviets to help them get better surrender terms. The Soviet invasion, which begins at midnight on August 8th, completely undermines Japan's diplomatic strategy, which was to try to help get the Soviets to help them get better surrender terms, and it undermines Japan's military strategy, which was to wait for the American invasion, inflict heavy casualties, and get better surrender terms that way. Most of the American military leaders are on record as saying that the atomic bombs were not necessary. In fact, 6 of America's 7 5-star admirals and generals who got their 5th star during the war are on record as saying that the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary or morally reprehensible, or both in most cases. We're talking about people who weren't pacifists. We're talking about Admiral Leahy, who was the chair of the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was Truman's personal chief of staff, Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur says the Japanese would have surrendered in May, and happily, if we told them they could keep the emperor. General Dwight Eisenhower, later becomes president, says that the Japanese were defeated. There was no reason to hit them with that damn thing. And I hate to see my country be the first to use it. Chester Nimitz, General King, Hap Arnold, all on record, as well as a lot of other military leaders saying that the Japanese were defeated. There was no need to use the atomic bomb. Leahy says we were barbarians in doing so. So we adopted the ethical standards of the barbarians of the Dark Ages. And so, but again, it's a narrative that most Americans are completely unaware of. If you look at the intelligence reports, April, May, June, July, they made very clear the Soviet invasion was to end the war, and the Soviet invasion did. When Prime Minister Suzuki was asked on August 10th why they had to surrender so quickly, he said that the Soviets are already taking Manchuria, they're taking Karafuto, pretty soon, he said next they'll be in Hokkaido. If that happens, the foundation of Japan is destroyed. We have to surrender while we can surrender to the Americans. What you have to realize is that the Americans have been firebombing Japanese cities ever since March. We wiped out and firebombed over 100 Japanese cities before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Destruction reached 99.5% in the city of Toyama, 99.5%. To the Japanese, who had recognized, Japanese leaders accepted that the United States could wipe out Japanese cities. To Japanese leaders, it didn't make a big difference if it was one plane and one bomb or 200 planes and thousands of bombs. They accepted we could wipe out cities. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply 2 more cities. But the Soviet invasion, as the leaders knew it would, changed the equation and forced the Soviet surrender at that point. Most Americans believe that the United States won the war in Europe. That's a pretty crazy notion if you study the war at all. For Americans, the narrative begins on December 7th, 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Then there's a brief interlude where we go and go on North Africa, invade North Africa, and then the underbelly and go up in Italy, Mediterranean. And then the real war for Americans starts on June 6, 1944, with the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The reality of the war was that throughout most of the war, the United States and the British were confronting 10 German divisions combined, while the Soviets throughout most of the war were confronting 200 German divisions combined. And it was the Soviets who won the war. Churchill said the Red Army tore the guts out of the Nazi war machine. The Nazis lost about 6 million on the Eastern Front and about 1 million on the Western Front. So, and Americans don't know this. The Americans lost, well, I asked my students, I did an anonymous survey with college students. They were all A students in high school. And I asked them, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer I got was 90,000. So they're only 300,000 off. I asked them, how many Soviets died in World War II? The median answer I got was 100,000, which means they were only 27 million off. Which means that these young kids, as smart as they might be, have no understanding of what the Cold War was about, have no idea what's going on in Ukraine now. They don't have the historical context to make sense out of that. You know what 27 million represents? After 9/11, the United States lost a little less than 3,000 people. After which, we've invaded country after country after country, wreaked havoc on the planet to get revenge and find the perpetrators. 27 million is the equivalent of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. That's what the Soviets suffered in World War II. When President Kennedy said it's the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago having been destroyed, he was not exaggerating. The Soviet losses were unimaginable. The horrors of World War II were unimaginable. And of course, as a result, they wanted a buffer zone between themselves and Germany. They've been invaded twice by Germany through Eastern Europe within the previous 25 years. The main demand that the Soviets had after World War II was a buffer zone. During World War II, they wanted a couple things. One thing that they wanted was a second front. The United States promised, in fact, in May 1942, President Roosevelt asked Stalin to send over Foreign Minister Molotov and a top Soviet general to come to Washington, D.C. They met with Roosevelt and General Marshall, and at that meeting, Roosevelt turns to Marshall and says, can we open up the second front before the end of World War II, before the end of 1942? And Marshall says yes, and Eisenhower says yes, we should before the end of 1942. The Americans promised to open up the second front. We don't open up the second front until June of 1944. That's largely because Churchill refused to go along. So during that time, the Soviets were bled to death on a massive scale. And then they turn the tide, they defeat the Germans, and then the Germans are retreating ahead of the Red Army, which is pushing toward Berlin. The American narrative then, after from June 6, 44, through the end of the war, the Americans march to Berlin and win the war. That's not what happened. So the other myth about the war is that the Soviet Union started the Cold War during World War II because of Soviet aggression and Soviet desire for territorial aggrandizement and the whole thing. What the Soviets wanted was a buffer zone. They wanted a buffer zone between themselves and Germany. They did not trust Germany after the war. And so the Americans initially had toyed with the idea of the Morgenthau Plan, which was to pasteurize Germany, deindustrialize Germany, never let Germany become a military and industrial power again. But the United States backed off of that notion. And so we look at how the Cold War really begins. Roosevelt's last telegram that he sends to Churchill says that these issues between the US and the Soviets pop up every day, and they all get resolved. He said, let's not make a big deal about that. The United States and the Soviets should remain friends in the post-war period. However, Truman becomes president on April 12, 1945. Truman had been vice president for 82 days before that, during which time Roosevelt never spoke to him twice, but never anything of substance. One of the amazing facts of the war is that when Truman became president, he did not even know that the United States was building an atomic bomb. Nobody had high enough regard for Truman to even tell him that the United States was building an atomic bomb. So as he becomes president, he's got to confront these major issues, and in my opinion, he gets them all wrong. So he gets advice. The people he gets advice from are the ones who Roosevelt had little regard for, especially when it came to foreign policy. Truman's first day in office, April 13th. He meets with Molotov on April 23rd, 10 days later. By that time, the whole mood of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had been flipped. Whereas Roosevelt wanted the United States and the Soviet Union to collaborate in the post-war period, he actually said to Molotov, what we need in the post-war period are 4 policemen. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China will together ensure world peace and stability. Molotov comes to meet with Truman on April 23rd. Truman accuses him and the Russians of having broken all of their wartime agreements, especially the Yalta agreements, especially over Poland. And Molotov is outraged by this, and Molotov says to Truman, I've never been spoken to that way in my life. Truman says, carry out your agreements, and you won't be spoken to like that.
Dr. Kuznick goes on to talk about the psychological issues that Harry Truman had, but he doesn't talk much about the counsel that Harry Truman received. And it's perfectly evident that there were people behind the scenes who were less than effective in terms of shaping Franklin Roosevelt, but they were enormously effective in determining the policies of Harry Truman. One of them is Henry Morgenthau Jr. Another one is Harry Dexter White, who was actually a communist, but he was an important economist. And I'm calling attention to them because from this point on, American foreign policy is much more determined by people in the shadows than it is by people in front of the microphone. I'm going to talk for a few moments about about evil aspects of World War II. And then after I show you Mike Parenti's discourse, I'll talk about one other. But it's important to realize that we have received a lot of propaganda about how evil Nazis were. And part of that is historical and real, and part of it, unfortunately, is mythological and intended to destroy discourse and understanding rather than enhance it. Parenti is going to be talking about some people in Germany who were intent on destroying the Nazis and avoiding World War II, whose offers were refused by the West, and I will tell you why they were refused by the West, because they wanted war. both bankers and substantial elements in Britain and in the United States wanted the Soviet Union to be severely wounded or destroyed. And they knew that Nazi ideology was antithetical to the communist ideology. They knew from what he had already said that Adolf Hitler both hated communism and Soviet communism and was probably paranoid about it. So the last thing they wanted to do was destroy the possibility of the Germans going to war. Now, they didn't want necessarily the Germans to attack England, but they did not want to let Germany remain strong without Germany destroying the Soviet Union. But I wanted to share with you a few factors. There's no doubt that Nazi ideology declared Aryan people superior, especially superior to Slavic peoples, the Russian people, which is very similar to Zionist ideology that declares Jews superior to Gentiles. Not all Jews, of course, not all Jews believe that, but it is intrinsic to the Zionist point of view, and it is well established in the Talmud that they appeal to. So the ideologies promote inhuman behavior. The mythic Holocaust that we talked about in this class in the past consists of three elements that didn't take place. But those three mythic elements that didn't take place do not preclude the possibility of sadistic and cruel German officers and men. Clearly don't. War is cruel, and it exists, and cruelty exists on American side, on Russian side, on British side, French side. And there's no question that populations were displaced from Germany to the east. Initially, socialists, trade unionists, and communists. Most of the communists in Germany were Jews, so that includes a lot of German Jews, were placed in concentration camps and slave labor camps for exactly the same reason that Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps in the United States. Is that prejudicial? Absolutely. It also happened.
But can I ask quickly?
Please, Damita.
What were the myths of the Nazis? Because
The myths of the mythic Holocaust are that there was an official policy of extermination, that there were gas chambers used as an important element in the execution of that order, and that 6 million Jews in fact perished. Those are the three official elements of what I am calling the mythological Holocaust.
But you're saying they didn't?
Pardon?
You're saying they didn't kill 6 million Jews?
They did not kill 6 million. They did not have gas chambers to kill 6 million. And there is no evidence whatsoever that there was an official policy to that effect.
Okay, so this sounds a lot like like some of the neo-Nazis say, that there was no blah, blah, blah.
On that particular point, the neo-Nazis might historically be right. Every once in a while, even an idiot gets something right.
Well, I've heard that actually 10 million people expired because it wasn't just Jews they were killing.
Now, are we talking about Jews or are we talking...
No, we're talking about people with deformities,
Yeah.
communists,
I'm
Slavic
not
people,
including those in the number. I'm talking about the mythic Jewish Holocaust. The mythological Jewish Holocaust claims that 6 million Jews, not human beings...
No, but 10 million if you add all the other people they killed.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
But
you're
I
saying,
don't know
oh, that's
about,
false.
I don't know about the 10 million. In fact, in terms of mythic Holocaust, I will tell you very frankly, those who emphasize the Jewish Holocaust don't even consider seriously whoever else died. Because their deaths are not nearly as important as the death of Jews.
Are there any Jews that say 6 million Jews didn't die?
That say what?
Are there any Jewish people who say that they did not kill 6 million Jewish people?
Oh yeah.
So is it widely known amongst the Jewish community that this didn't happen?
No, in fact, it is widely denied among the Jewish community.
Okay, I won't interrupt anymore with
No.
this stream, but I want to follow it up later because it's very concerning.
I will give you two names.
Okay.
Jürgen Graf, G-R-A-F, has written extensively on it. He's not Jewish. David Cole, C-O-L-E, is Jewish, and he is available on YouTube and did an extensive investigation at Auschwitz. And David Cole demonstrates the lack of evidence of gas chambers. In fact, the absurdity of the assertion of gas chambers, okay?
How many did die?
We don't know.
But like, you don't have an estimate?
The estimates range from of Jews between 150,000 and 1.3 million. And what confuses the number even more, these are
It's
good
still a
questions.
Holocaust.
Pardon me?
It's still a Holocaust.
Oh, I'm not denying that.
Okay.
I'm not denying that Jews were officially persecuted, because they were.
For instance, forever, yeah.
Yeah. Many of them initially because they were communists, but subsequently, partly because of what the Jews did to Germans in the economic boycott of 1933, and partly because people became progressively nuts later on.
But the problems that they've had in Europe since whenever, like they go outside of Germany, like across Europe, they've alienated and excluded Jewish people, and they've had all these horrendous myths about them. And
There are mistakes and misinterpretations on both sides, and the Saker, whom you can read at thesaker.is, has an extensive article on why some people persecute some Jews. I'll put it that way.
all right, I'm sorry for the
No,
diversion. But,
in fact,
yeah.
sooner or later we're going to come back to the question of Zionism, but I'm trying to show that the influence of Zionists on Western culture and on American culture extends from the question of making official history the Holocaust to controlling Western media to Steven Spielberg's The Rescue of Private Ryan and Schindler's List, both of which are excellent propaganda films. Because the best way to present propaganda is where the public doesn't recognize it as propaganda. And both of those films appear to be historical in nature, and they are 95% and very effective propaganda.
What? I have to say, I have to be at work at 3, and I'm
I'm
sorry.
glad you came for an hour.
I'm so sorry I'm going to miss the rest, but keep up the good work.
You can't, Dawn will have it. You can
Okay.
download the rest of it.
All right, thank you so much.
Oh, may I ask, then,
Please.
would the perpetrators of the Jewish Holocaust myth be invested in minimizing the suffering of the Soviet Union? Is that what that's about?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Russian Jews and Ashkenazi Jews historically have a profound hostility toward Russia. They hated, you can go back to when the Jewish community in the Polish kingdom, the Jewish community was largely middlemen between the aristocracy and the peasants. And when the Polish kingdom was overthrown in the middle of the 18th century, the Jews suffered terribly, partly, well, they will say they suffered innocently, and other people will say they suffered because they were middlemen for cruel nobility. We'll let that go for the moment. But when they became part of the Russian Empire, they never integrated, and some will say they were never allowed to integrate into the Russian Empire. Solzhenitsyn has written, in fact, the one book that he has written that has not been officially translated into English is called 200 Years Together. Solzhenitsyn writes about the hostilities and interactions between Jewish people in Russia and Russian people in Russia. And the Ashkenazi Jews have been hostile towards Russia since the 1700s. In fact, American Jews at the beginning of World War I were supportive of the Germans because the Germans were fighting the French, the English, and the Russians. And the American Jews wanted the Russian Tsar to get his ass kicked. It was only when Great Britain promised Palestine to the Jews that American Jews changed their mind and decided to be against Germany rather than for Germany. Because Palestine was more important than kicking the Tsar. Am I communicating so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So except for that interlude, American Jews and the Jewish community generally have been terribly hostile towards Russia, and they still are. So, we've gotten off a bit, but I wanted to say that in terms of evil consequences, we are told that the Germans conducted the war in a very evil fashion. Go to both Schindler's List and go to Saving Private Ryan, and you'll see the propaganda about how Nazis behaved. What I want, and I'm not saying that there were not evil people. I will give you a few simple facts. Germans returned to the Allies a much higher percentage of prisoners of war alive to the Allies than the Allies presented to the Germans after World War II. Moreover, Dwight David Eisenhower changed the designation of a large number of German prisoners from prisoners of war to disarmed German combatants. By that simple administrative change, he robbed them of any protections they would have had under the Geneva Conventions. And it is thought that hundreds of thousands and possibly millions died of starvation and exposure in open-air prison camps that they were kept in for months, even up to over a year, without returning them to their German families and homes. If you want to talk about how people behave, we have nothing to call out our exceptionalism unless you want to appeal to General Sherman and his treatment of Atlanta, Georgia. Now I'm going to have Michael Parenti give you his take on events up to and including the war itself. Less animated because you get the audio, not the video.
This is Michael Parenti for Real History, a series of talks by me about important and controversial themes in history, many of which have been buried or ignored by those who control our intellectual environment. Those who control our vision of the past Hitler was a maniac and bent on world conquest, and nothing could stop him. Second, the West tried to avoid war by appeasing him. Third, the Soviet Union entered into an unholy alliance with Hitler in the Hitler-Stalin Pact and collaborated and made possible for him to have his successes. I want to show that all three of these statements are misleading and in some respects downright false in their implications. Let's begin with the first one. Hitler could have been stopped. He was not unstoppable, and there were powerful forces in the German army itself that were ready to stop him. In 1935, Hitler unilaterally scrapped the Versailles Peace Treaty that limited Germany to 7 divisions. He began a major mobilization of 21 divisions. He then told his generals he was going to move toward 36 divisions. His generals were stunned. 7 divisions was woefully inadequate, but this was a mobilization for another total war in Europe. In 1937, Hitler told his general staff that indeed he planned war against France, Poland, and Russia, and it would come sometime within the next 6 years. In fact, it came within 2 years. Again, Hitler's generals were absolutely flabbergasted about this and really concerned. Another war, a total war against all of Europe, was one that would bring the inevitable defeat and destruction of Germany. Well, what happened was a concerted conspiracy was begun by the German General Staff to kill Hitler and remove the Nazis from power. The Wehrmacht, the German army, would surround and move against the Nazi SS divisions. Key commanders would move their divisions in place and take over the Nazi elite forces. A special commando unit would be set up to storm Hitler's headquarters and kill him. The generals did not see how Germany could fight 2 million French, the entire Polish army, and the small but powerful Czechoslovakian army, not to mention the British, who would be joining in inevitably. To save Germany, they decided to move against Hitler, but they got no cooperation from the West. In 1936, Hitler violated the Versailles Peace Treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland. England and France did nothing to stop him. Hitler said England and France would do nothing to stop. His generals said it was too risky to move into the Rhineland. England and France proved Hitler right. In 1938, the generals were about to strike. Much of the German general staff was involved. They hated Adolf Hitler. They hated the way the Nazis had treated the German military staff. And I counted about 60 or so senior officers who were eventually executed by the Nazis or arrested or died one way or the other when these plans were eventually exposed. So they were ready to move again, but Hitler annexed Austria, and the Western leaders did nothing, and the plans to do in Hitler had to be postponed. They were temporarily politically impossible because Hitler was triumphing so much. The Western Allies gave him Austria on a platter. It was hard to convince people that Hitler was destroying Germany when in fact he seemed to be empowering Germany. Later that same year, in September 1938, war loomed inevitably. It seemed inevitable again. A war that the German generals believed they could not win. Hitler was laying claim to the entire western industrial base of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. It was time to act. To destroy Hitler or Germany would be destroyed, was the thinking among the German general staff. And by the way, not just with the German military, but with other elements in the Abwehr, which was the German secret intelligence, not the Nazi Gestapo, not the Nazi party, but the government group, and a number of other groups. They were people who felt that Hitler had to be stopped. They were themselves all pretty much conservatives, by the way. By mid-September, the conspirators believed they had the pistol cocked and ready, aimed at the head of state. All that was needed was the order to pull the trigger. The trigger pulling would be initiated by Hitler himself when he announced publicly his intention to seize Czechoslovakia by force. And the hammer would fly forward when the British and French handed down their decision to go to war over the principle of safeguarding the integrity of small nations. Beck believed this is what they would do. Beck was the German general who was in charge of the conspiracy. The Czechoslovakian people believed that the British and French would do the very same thing, you know. At that same time, Hitler ordered a panzer division with supporting infantry to parade through Berlin. The crowd stood sullenly and watched them pass. This is Mason's description, by the way. It's a very interesting point. He notes that the Fuhrer had hoped for enthusiasm. Watching the apathetic reaction from a chancellery window, he was disgusted. He turned away and he said to an adjutant, "I can't wage a war yet with people like this." In other words, the German people were not all that gung-ho about war.
I'm going to just comment on that. Compare that to the newsreels that you see that demonstrate the German people were adoring Adolf Hitler and encouraging him and basically telling him, yeah, go. That's ain't necessarily so.
They just had a bitter and terrible war just 17 years before, and they remember the hardships and the loss and whatever else. So Hitler did not have mass support for war, much outside his party. Well, the German generals were ready to move against Hitler if he struck against Czechoslovakia and led to an impossible war. But once again, British Prime Minister Chamberlain came to Hitler's rescue. The Czechs were ready to fight. The Soviet Union was ready to fight and said it would join Czechoslovakia in the war against Hitler. The Soviet Union made repeated overtures to Great Britain and France and Poland and Czechoslovakia for a joint military pact, security pact against Hitler, that if he attacked any one of them, he would be attacked by all of them. But the British and French refused to join such a pact. Instead, the British and French hurried to Munich and gave Hitler the Sudetenland. The German general plan was collapsed. There was going to be no threat of war. There was going to be no danger to Germany. There was going to be no reason to move against Hitler. The conspirators pulled back. Czechoslovakia was not even allowed to attend Munich. It was at the Munich conference that Chamberlain gave Hitler Czechoslovakia, and that was the beginning of the end of the peace. 5 months later, Hitler moved in and took all of Czechoslovakia. By the way, even after Munich, the Soviet Union offered to stand with Czechoslovakia, even offering to send troops in planes. The Soviets, however, were denied passage to Czechoslovakia by Poland. Poland was a right-wing military dictatorship, and Poland thereby did its small part in the digging of its own grave. Let's take the second explanation, that Great Britain and France appeased Hitler, and this is what led to the war. They proved weak and had no backbone. Well, they were war-weary and they were unwilling to fight. They were willing to take peace at any price. That's really not quite true. They had been war-weary after World War I, and yet they proved themselves very willing to fight. Right after World War I, British and French and 12 other nations sent expeditionary forces to invade and fight in Soviet Russia, as it was still called then, to overthrow the Russian Revolution. So they were quite ready to fight if it was to fight communists. They were not ready to fight the fascists. They were reluctant to confront Germany even when it was weak and could have been stopped in 1935 when it had only about 7 or 10 divisions. They had wind that the German generals were wavering. They had wind that there was a very serious conspiracy afoot. The British intelligence heard from the Abwehr, the German secret service, secret intelligence. The Abwehr tried to feed London secret information on the Nazi buildup. Chamberlain was not interested. Chamberlain failed to respond to all overtures from the anti-Nazi Germans, even high-placed ones who commanded divisions of troops, even conservative ones. In other words, I believe Chamberlain was not an appeaser. He was an active collaborator of Adolf Hitler's. They actively encouraged Hitler's policy. On Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain himself threatened Czechoslovakia if the Czechs failed to accept Munich. He threatened to freeze their assets. He would deny them all materials if they decided to stand up alone against Germany. And he handed over all Czech assets in England to Adolf Hitler when Hitler took over all of Czechoslovakia. He engaged in the active participation and dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and handed it over to the Nazis on a platter. Chamberlain saw Hitler and Nazism as a bulwark against communism in Germany. And he saw Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism in Europe. With a few exceptions like Winston Churchill, Western leaders were more concerned with the Bolshevik specter than with the fascist reality. They were uneasy about Hitler's emergent power, But they didn't look upon fascism with the same loathing and fear that they did communism. Unlike the communists, the fascists were not a threat to private enterprise. If anything, the fascists had crushed socialist organizations in Germany and Italy and had made these countries safer for private capital. Now, to be sure, Chamberlain and his associates were eager to avoid war. They didn't want war, but much of that eagerness arose not from some kind of pacifism, some commitment to peace, or peace at any price, but from a willingness to strike the kind of bargain with a Nazi leader that they would never dream of entering into with the Soviets. The British historian Geoffrey Barakoff argued, quote, Hitler's successes in foreign policy would do less to German rearmament, the deficiencies and limitations of which were known to competent military circles, than to the tacit alliance of powerful reactionary elements in England and France, which, although loath to see a reassertion of German equality, was still more unwilling to check it by military alliance with Soviet Russia, or to run the risk of social revolution in Germany as a result of Hitler's fall. In other words, I'm not saying that Chamberlain necessarily loved Hitler, although there were plenty of leaders in the West who did. There was all sorts of people in America. Henry Ford was an open Nazi admirer, and a number of other American plutocrats, and a number of people in England also. But Chamberlain's feeling was, if I had to choose between Nazism, Hitler, or the risk, even the risk of Soviet influence in Germany, then we will take Nazism. They could much better live with the reality, the horrible reality of fascism, than with the future imagined risk of socialism. Western leaders had never really quite reconciled themselves to the existence of a socialist Russia. And they, at the same time, they did fear Germany's growing strength. So their strategy was to turn Hitler's aggression against the USSR. So it wasn't appeasement. Chamberlain went to Munich because he had a plan. And that plan was to give Hitler what he wanted and then send Hitler east to attack Bolshevik Russia. After all, Chamberlain and his party had just attacked Bolshevik Russia. Let's see, we're talking 1939. They had just been there just 18 years before, 1921, invading Russia and trying to stop the revolution. By the way, this was not an altogether unrealistic plan. Given the rabid anti-communism and anti-Sovietism professed by the Nazi leaders, they were quite ready, and they talked about moving east, you know. The commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, General Gamelin, wrote in his memoirs that one of the aims of the Anglo-French alliance was to bring about a clash between German and Soviet interests. Harry Truman had made that famous statement. We ought to let Hitler and Stalin fight each other until they totally exhaust each other.
I'm going to stop there and share with you one additional vignette. Parenti makes a very good case that the ruling elites in Western Europe and in the United States were much more willing to live with Nazi Germany in place. The myth that Hitler was attempting to conquer the world is just that, it's a myth. He did intend to conquer Russia, and more in order to protect his other flank, he attacked France. But Parenti makes a very good case that Western elites were much more willing to live with a Nazi Germany than they were to live with a Soviet Union, and they were willing to avoid war with Hitler as long as he was going to go eastward. In fact, even after they declared war on Hitler, they didn't do anything until well after Hitler had invaded France and the Low Countries, because he did that shortly after they had declared war. But England and France, England made the one effort to invade Europe with the, where is that area on the sea coast where the British troops were almost wiped out.
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk, thank you. The British made a small invasion. It was fairly rapidly surrounded, and they had to scoot back home on commandeered vessels. And the evidence is strong that Adolf Hitler intentionally did not move on those cornered troops until they had had a good opportunity to evacuate them. They wanted Hitler to move eastward, and he did. And Stalin, who was no angel, wanted a pact with the Western powers, and they wouldn't give it to him. So Operation Barbarossa was conducted with 200 divisions. The war, in a tactical sense, was lost in February of 1943. What do I mean by that? In February of 1943, Stalingrad was held and the German troops were surrounded in the siege of what started out as the siege of Stalingrad. Russian troops eventually weakened the German troops and with reinforcements surrounded the German troops, and Hitler forbade the German troops to surrender. Incredible, but mistakes are made all the time. In that operation and the failure of the German troops to take Stalingrad and move toward the oil resources of what is now Kazakhstan, the war was tactically lost. There was still going to be a whole lot more fighting and a whole lot more dying. But from that point on, Soviet troops were moving westward, German troops were not moving eastward. Western troops did not start invading Europe for another 18 to 24 months after that. They were, I'm not decrying the heroism of the troops that were fighting in North Africa and Italy, but everyone knew the war was going to be won or lost in Europe, and the West did not open a second front in Europe until June of 1944. Now, in terms of good guys and bad guys, there is simply one additional fact about the conduct of the war I want to share with you. Actually, I guess two. Both Hitler and Churchill, early on in the aerial war, were hitting military targets in England and in France and Germany. One German pilot dropped one bomb on a non-military area north of London. And with that, Winston Churchill said they have now started bombing populated areas, non-military targets. And with that, Winston Churchill approved of the saturation bombing of German cities. If you look at the saturation bombing reports, especially of Hamburg, they were not only intended to destroy industrial and military targets. They were intended to kill as many civilians as possible with the intent of destroying the morale of the German people. This program of destroying the morale of the German people was conducted subsequently in Japan. You heard earlier that American troops were destroying city after city in Japan, wasting the entire city. Churchill and the British military found out that to kill the maximum number of civilians, you wanted to have air raids separated by precisely 3 hours. Why 3 hours? That gave the fires that were started by the first raid to gather enough steam to spread to other parts and to not give the, to give the fires enough chance to spread, but also to get the first responders out into the streets. The second wave was intended to start more fires and kill those first responders, either with bombs or with fires. The Americans currently are doing the same thing, or were doing currently the same thing in Iraq, where they would have a drone destroy a party, either a party of terrorists or a wedding party, and they would specifically wait for the first responders to come out, and snipers would pick off the first responders. In that little film that Manning revealed shows the snipers intentionally waiting for first responders to come out and picking them off. I won't make any comments about ethics, but the goal was to start huge fires, to wait for the first responders to come out, and to add more fires to it. Dresden is located on the eastern part of Germany, was unaffected by aerial bombardment, partly because it had no industrial center, and probably partly because it had a large population of prisoners of war. 2 months before the end of the war, with the Soviet troops about 50 miles to the northeast, Dresden was attacked by 2 successive waves of British bombers and a 3rd wave of American bombers, with the sole purpose of creating a fire that has not been seen since. There is a video that I am tempted to show you, but I won't, by Jimmy Moglia, M-O-G-L-I-A, who is a very good observer. But the design was to create a firestorm, and it was so effective in the city of Dresden that people who tried to save themselves by escaping from buildings were caught in melted tar in the streets and were destroyed in the second wave of bombings. In the fiery destruction of Dresden, approximately 130,000 people died, twice the number that died in Hiroshima.
What was the motivation? I mean, why did they do, what was the
purpose?
Yes.
The official purpose, I'm glad you asked the question, Janet, because I may have strayed off. The official purpose was, as Winston Churchill gave it, Stalin asked them to do it because the Soviet troops were about to get there. Stalin denied asking for it. It made no logistical sense. There are 2 possibilities, and possibly both were active in this case. As with the dropping of the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there is a strong probability that that some people in the American military wanted to demonstrate to the Soviets that they were capable of being this barbaric. There is the possibility that the same mentality was operative in Dresden, because when the Soviets arrived in Dresden a few days later, the city was functionally gone. And I will remind you of what Eisenhower said about Germans. He said to his wife, "God, I hate the Germans." And there is very little doubt that in the minds of at least some executors of World War II, simple hatred of Germans was operative. The long and short story that I share with you is that you have been given a chocolate-covered fake story about the United States involvement in World War II. And the plain story is the major difference between Stalin and Winston Churchill is that Stalin spoke Russian and Churchill spoke English. The main difference between Churchill and Roosevelt on the one hand and Stalin and Hitler on the other is that Stalin and Hitler were operating on ideologies, and Churchill and Roosevelt primarily were operating on the basis of ruling elite greed and the desire to establish a Western hegemony over the rest of the world. Not a glorious difference, but a significant strategic difference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Methamphetamine played in the war making and the.
All sorts of experiments were performed in attempting to increase the aggressiveness and durability of the soldiers, whether that includes methamphetamines and any of a number of other kinds of stimulants, and it clearly included propaganda. The whole purpose of boot camp is to teach young men to do what their mothers taught them not to do. But methamphetamines were part of the more human beings became the subject of experimentation, whether we're talking about social experimentation or chemical experimentation, there were functionally no limits to the willingness of people to experiment on other human beings. The Americans sought desperately to find out what the Japanese had discovered by the Japanese experiments on other human beings. Americans have experimented on American troops and on the American people, and they were desperate to get the information that people like Josef Mengele had acquired in the experimentation on poor unfortunates in Germany.
I had read some accounts that there were tons of methamphetamine stockpiled after the war that were still existing. They were using it on
I have no information on
an
that.
industrial scale. They were giving it to their... See, films of Hitler, he's obviously in a state of... There's somewhere he's just like totally... You can see that he's completely under the
Disconnected.
control of something. Some kind of...
Well, that may have been a factor in the German defense of Berlin, because Berlin was defended by old men and little boys, street by street by street. And I don't believe they believed in Hitler that much, although they may have believed in the sovereignty of Berlin that much.
Well, I think this methamphetamine is one of the secrets that has been successfully kept for up until just recently.
Once you open up the door to experimentation on human beings as research experiments, then that's not simply a slippery slope, that's a greased skid. And once you accept the thesis that human beings are worth manipulating, is there any limit
Well,
to
I'm
the
just
extent that you don't know?
thinking in terms of you have a chronic methamphetamine use, there tends to be paranoia and psychosis.
There are a host of negative side effects to any of those chemical manipulations.
You have a war with fuel by
Well,
use.
eventually what happens is that the directed aggression becomes undirected. And undirected aggression and undirected hostility is every bit as dangerous to the researcher as it is to the person you want to be attacked. I mean, that's a chemical fact. I can take anesthetics and I can make you hallucinate, I can make you sleepy, or I can kill you. Same drug, different dose.